we're ready to start. Ladies and gentlemen, if everyone's got their headphones on, can people headphone on, please? Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me okay? Nods and smiles, excellent, thank you. Welcome to this afternoon's session on better information. Thanks very much for coming, and a warm welcome to those who are joining us on our live YouTube stream. And I've been asked to mention that this is available on demand on YouTube if you want to see it twice after this session, and it's also a way of accessing the slides. So my name is Tony Stafford. I'm a member of the regulatory policy team at the SRA. The programme said that I'd be joined by my colleague Jackie Griffiths. She's not been able to make it, sadly, but I am joined by a colleague of mine, Richard Silver, from the policy team, who's been working on this topic a lot longer than I have, so he's here to help me out with any really difficult questions later on. I should start by saying, Richard and I were saying earlier, the title Better Information is actually weirdly uninformative, and that's probably a lesson for the future. We just noticed that the programme for tomorrow, someone has a session called How to Hire a Hitman on the Dark Web, which will probably bring in a much better crowd, so we'll learn from that for the future. But what this session is about better information for consumers, and in particular information to help consumers make choices about the options when they're looking for legal services. So I'll just run quickly through what we're going to cover in the next half hour or so. Start just by giving a little background to why this is on our agenda, why we think it matters, and then on what we and others have been doing to promote better information for consumers over the last few years, what we're doing at the moment, because there's a lot of activity going on right across the sector, and a little bit about what's going to happen over the next year or so. Then we'll talk about some practical sort of takeaway hints that might be of interest to people if you're thinking as lawyers, as legal firms, about what you can do to help inform consumers and convince people that you are the right advisor for them. And we'll have some time for questions at the end. So, with no further ado, sorry. Okay, slides have gone slightly wrong, so that's what we're going to cover. So going back to the start of this, the catalyst for the SRA really getting heavily involved in the topic of information for consumers was a major review that the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, did back in 2016. And they published a report that had an awful lot of evidence that showed that, in their view, competition wasn't working in the legal services sector, particularly for individual consumers and for small businesses looking for legal help. And they said a big part of that problem was that the information available to people to make informed choices wasn't good enough. There was a real lack of clarity around things like price, around level of service, around quality. And they kind of threw down a challenge to the frontline legal regulators, including the SRA, to take action to fix that, to bring in changes so that there'd be more information available to consumers and to help consumers navigate the legal services sector and make good choices. And one of the things that the CMA review sparked was a follow-up report by the Legal Services Consumer Panel, which was published in 2017, on basically how to make new requirements around information work for consumers. And that had a lot of good advice in it, so things like make sure that what you're doing is tested with consumers, so you're not just guessing at what they might find useful, and make sure that where they do get prompts to have information, that those come at the right point in their journey towards trying to find legal advice. So those are principles that I think everyone in the sector, certainly all the regulators, have been mindful of ever since. We've continued to work with the consumer panel on the work that we've taken forward since then. And a quick sort of overview of what the SRA has been doing. As I say, all the legal regulators are working on this because we all have a remit to promote competition and to promote the interests of consumers in the sector. So it's a big deal for all of us. Probably the biggest single step that the SRA has taken since 2016, which many of you will be familiar with, is we introduced new transparency rules at the end of 2018. And those require firms that do certain types of legal work, so things like conveyancing, sort of non-contentious probate, there's some employment work, things like motoring offences. Firms doing that kind of work now have to publish information for consumers on their websites about the pricing structure they use and about how long things are likely to take, about the level of disbursements that may be involved, and also about the qualifications of the people who will actually be doing the work, to try and give people a better idea of what things might cost them. Linked to that, we introduced the SRA clickable logo, which is now a requirement for the firms we authorise to have on their websites. And that's really there to show consumers who's regulating the firm, to give them confidence that there is a regulatory structure behind them. And we've launched the Solicitors Register, which is, as you'll know, is an online portal that now lists every authorised solicitor in England and Wales. So again, increasing transparency, making it easier for consumers to see who they'd be working with if they used a particular firm. More of a back office thing, but we've also overhauled the way in which our systems share the regulatory data that we collect and that we publish with third parties, so people like the comparison websites and the review websites that we'll be talking about a bit in this session. And along with the other legal regulators, we've committed to overhauling the Legal Choices website, which a lot of you will be familiar with. Really is a way of helping consumers to think about the options that they have when they realise that they need legal advice. So that's a major ongoing piece of work. So what impact has all that work had? I think probably the biggest step we've taken since we made those changes is in 2020, we published a one-year evaluation of the transparency rules, which was really looking at what difference has this made to consumers. And I won't read through all the numbers on the slides, but it did confirm that a lot of people were using the information that's now out there, especially around pricing and level of service, and we're finding it helpful. I think the most interesting statistic on that slide is the last one, for those of you who can see it. So of the people who actually checked the pricing, the information on pricing on firms' websites, only 10% of them who'd done that said that they felt that it wouldn't be affordable to instruct a solicitor. And that's actually a massive change from some research that was done in 2015, so before all these changes came in, where I think it was over 60% of individual consumers said they felt it would be unaffordable to instruct a lawyer, and the figure for small businesses was higher, it was over 80%. So I think that's really interesting. That's telling us that when potential clients know more about what it'll cost to use legal advice, that actually takes some of the fear out of it, and they feel more confident they'll be able to afford it. So that's good for consumers, that's good for access to justice, which is another of our regulatory objectives, but I think also potentially really useful to law firms if you've got more people who are potentially willing to consider using your services. So that was our assessment of how the transparency rules were going. The Competition and Markets Authority then came back and had another look at the sector in 2020. And they looked at what had gone on right across the piece, and they looked at the additional information that was out there and the evidence of how people were using it, including the work that we'd done, the evaluation that we'd done, which they leaned heavily on. And they said, okay, there's been a lot of good progress here, and we can see there is better information around pricing, and we can see that's making a difference. But they said, we still think there's some more that could be done by the regulators in things like pricing, so the information isn't always prominent enough on websites and things like that. We'll talk a bit more later about what we're doing around some of those recommendations. But the big thing they said, in terms of information for consumers, is there's just not enough out there on quality of services. And that's a real drawback when consumers are trying to choose between different providers. So, okay, they can see about price, but we know from research that price isn't the driving factor, the biggest driving factor in many people's choice of legal advice. What they're really interested in is the reputation, the quality, the track record of the people that they'll be working with, because they're doing things that need to be done right. So it makes sense, they're really keen to know about quality. But quality is quite a tricky thing to tackle, and so at the start of this year, we thought, and we talked to the Legal Services Board, the other legal regulators, we thought we actually need to do a really big piece of work around this, just to understand how quality indicators work, and what works especially for consumers, going back to that recommendation from the consumer panel. So we launched something called the Quality Indicators Pilot. I think pilot in a way is a slightly misleading name for it, because it's not a sort of a new product that we're testing out before we launch it generally. It's more of a sort of rolling experiment. So we're working with all kinds of people to test what things might work in terms of improving quality indicators for consumers, and then to get feedback and couple that with research, again, around what consumers actually find helpful. So it's a big piece of work. It's focusing to start with on two areas of law, conveyancing and employment. Started, as I say, in February this year, and the first phase, which is still running, has been around trying to look at improving people's engagement in review websites. So the kind of websites that probably everyone in this section, in this hall, uses for all kinds of things, but people don't necessarily use for legal services. And our starting point with that really was, we're not testing whether quality indicators are a good thing. We're convinced that they are. What we need to work out is what kind of information we can actually make available to consumers in a way that works for firms and that is comprehensible to consumers and meets their needs. And review websites seem to us to be a good way into that, because it's an easy way for consumers to compare different providers at once rather than having to go to each firm's website in turn. So on this pilot we're working, as you can see from the logos at the bottom of the screen, with several of the other legal regulators, also with the Law Society, the Consumer Panel, the Legal Ombudsman, and some other bodies, and we'll talk a bit about what we're doing with them as we go through. But we're also working with lots of other people. First of all, we're working with some of these websites themselves, the comparison websites and the review websites. They tend to be abbreviated in the industry to DCTs, Digital Comparison Tools, which is a very ungainly title, but I will probably use it occasionally because it saves time. So we've engaged with quite a few of those. I know at least one of them is exhibiting here today. I'm not sure if they've joined us for this session. Yes, hello? Give a wave. So there's a gentleman you could talk to there after this session if you're interested. And there's a wide range of them. You'll see from the logos on the slide, from people like Trustpilot, who operate in all kinds of sectors, to some that are much more focused on the professional services sector, and some that are really primarily focused on the legal sector or on sort of life events such as moving house, which can involve things like conveyancing services as well as surveying or removal services. And when we started entering into these discussions, we picked up from people in the legal sector that there was some nervousness around working with third-party websites. Something that people quite often say is, well, the review websites, we can't be sure if those are genuine reviews, if those are real clients, or if they're someone who was on the other side in the case and is annoyed that they lost. We can't be sure what the business models of some of the sites are. So early on, we drew up a voluntary sort of code of conduct for the sites that we're working with. You can see that on our website. There's a lot of information about all of this on our website if you search for online reviews. So that covers things like sort of dealing with concerns from a firm that a review might not be genuine, and making sure that there are ways to deal with that, and being clear about commercial interests and business models. So that's great. We're really excited to have such a good range of websites working with us on this. The other people, of course, we needed to involve are law firms. And we worked with the Law Society and with the Employment Lawyers Association back at the start of the year to try and interest people in joining in with this pilot. And we were actually really pleased with the response. So we have over 70 firms that have got involved with us. They cover a really good range from sole practitioners up to big firms. And geographically, they're right across England and Wales. We've got people in Cornwall, we've got people in Newcastle. So it's giving us a really good opportunity to experiment and to test how some of the things that we're asking people to try out work in different parts of the country and in different sizes of business. So what are we doing with all these people? The first phase, as I say, entirely focused on online reviews. And the first thing we did really was say to the firms, okay, there are some things we'd like you to try. So this is all without commitment, and some of them may already have been doing some of these things. So we said, why don't you try asking your conveyancing clients and your employment clients to write a review of their experience of you after the transaction that they've used you for, and point them towards a channel that you want them to use, and then find a way of making what they say available to other people, to consumers, to prospective clients of yours. So either by publishing it on your website or by having a link on your site through to one of the third-party sites that we're encouraging people to work with. We also said, whatever you as a firm choose to do in this area, online reviews are out there and they're not going away, and probably some of your past clients have already said things about you online. So why don't you find out what they are? Why don't you go online, have a look, see what people have said, and if it was reasonably recent and there's something you want to engage with, something maybe you disagree with, then get involved. You have a right to reply generally on these sites. Make use of that, start the conversation, see what happens. And then tell us about what you find. So since February we've been running webinars, we've had meetings with the firms, with the DCTs, to find out what's working, what isn't working for them, and to sort of assess whether there are any barriers or any things we can do to make it easier for people to use these channels. We've also been talking to consumers and getting a program of research underway, as I say, to find out what works for them. We actually had a brilliant focus group in our Birmingham office last week. I think it was the first face-to-face focus group the SRA had been able to do for 18 months. And that was fascinating, seeing how people were engaged in some of these questions and the questions they asked and what worked for them and what didn't work for them. So there's a lot more we're going to be able to draw out from that process. So in terms of the initial learning that we're hearing from firms about this, I'm just going to flash up 3 quotes from firms who've been involved in the pilot with us, which I think illustrate different aspects of what they've got out of the pilot so far. And again, I won't read this out, but the first one is about sort of the positive business aspects of having online reviews out there. So a firm that found they were actually getting approached by people because they'd seen good things about them online, and these weren't people in their normal part of the world. Obviously that won't necessarily work for all business models, but from their point of view, it was really interesting and a good thing that they had people coming to them who wouldn't otherwise know they existed. Second quote was about the sort of positive impact that receiving a positive review can have on your own staff and your team. So people saying, it really energizes people when they get a good review, and quite often reviews will name the team involved and thank individuals for the way they've behaved, the way they've communicated with the client. And I think that's powerful, not just because it's an acknowledgement. It's nice to get a thank you, in the same way as it's nice to get a thank you card at the end of a transaction. But of course, the review's out there. It's up there, it's public, the whole world can see it. And to have what you've done validated in that way can actually be really powerful for people. But the third quote, again, I think is the most interesting, because it's about the less positive reviews. And as I said, we've known from the start that some people are anxious about how to deal with less positive reviews. They're a fact of life. If you look at any service, any restaurant, hotel, however wonderful it is on TripAdvisor, you'll see some 1-star reviews. Sometimes people just have had a bad experience for reasons that the service provider won't necessarily know about or be able to do much about. And again, we have published some guidance for firms on how to deal with reviews like that. But one firm said to us, actually, it's really good. Having negative reviews, as long as they're not just randomly negative, as long as there's some kind of issue in there that we can deal with and engage with, it's helpful to us. It's good information for us to know when things go wrong. And actually, if you engage positively with a negative review and people can see that you're engaging with it, even if it's just to say, we're not actually sure that you're one of our clients, but please get in touch because we'd like to resolve this issue, that sends a pretty powerful signal to people out in the world who are looking at what you do and how you do it. So a lot of different types of positive feedback from firms so far. Now we'll be taking all the feedback we get and evaluating it next year when the pilot's finished, and then in due course we'll be publishing that and telling people what we think are the next steps, whether there's any regulatory action to follow up. So this is already just giving you a flavour of the work in progress at the moment. And we also, of course, asked for feedback from the websites that we're working with, the digital comparison tools. And again, some of them have said, yeah, actually it's been interesting for us. We've seen a real uptick in the proportion of firms that want to engage with us. And it's not just firms who are sort of actively engaged in the pilot. I think the fact that we're doing the pilot has raised awareness in the sector a bit of what's out there. And we're also seeing we're seeing websites saying that firms engage with them in different ways. So some of them will use the sort of free-to-use services that a lot of sites offer. Some will take out a subscription which gives them potentially more services. And that's great. Again, that's all more information for the pilot about what works for firms as well as for consumers and why. And briefly, we're getting towards the end. The second and final phase of the pilot, which we're just about to kick off really now, is around using objective data. So moving on from the subjective reviews that clients might write to looking at what other kinds of data are out there that might inform consumers about the sort of firms that they're thinking about using for legal services. And this is quite a tricky area. I mean, there's lots of data out there that has a bearing on how legal services are performed. And there are a few examples on the slides of things that we're planning to explore in the next phase of the pilot. So inviting conveyancing firms to publish information about that the land registry holds about the level of transactions, the number of applications that result in some kind of inquiry coming back from the land registry. Information from employment firms about the outcomes of the cases they work on, and of course there can be all kinds of different outcomes at different stages. And potentially for both conveyancing and employment firms, information about legal ombudsman complaints that they get. Now all these areas are quite tricky because none of them are a simple indicator of quality. If they were, this would be nice and straightforward. But we all know that there can be any number of reasons why there's a hold up in a conveyancing transaction. There can be any number of reasons why an employment dispute ends the way it does. And certainly ombudsman cases can come up for all kinds of reasons, and the outcomes can be influenced by all kinds of factors. So none of these things in themselves will tell you whether or not you're going to get a high quality experience from a legal firm. And one of the things we really want to explore in the next phase of the pilot that's coming up is how firms can contextualize some of this information for consumers to help them understand what it means and also help them understand how the data for different firms might compare. And again, we're talking to the digital comparison tools about how they can use some of this information as well, because a lot of it is widely available. Some of them do already use some of it. Things like legal ombudsman data is actually available at the moment through the Legal Choices website. So a lot of this information's out there, but how do we use it? That's the question that we're aiming to answer with the next phase of the pilot. So as I say, we're running this till about February, and we'll be exploring objective data for the next few months. The next phase will be the evaluation phase, and then we'll be going public on what we've learned and on what we think the logical next steps are. Again, talking to the Legal Services Board, talking to other legal regulators, talking to the Consumer Panel, the Law Society, and everyone with an interest. So it's been continues to be a really interesting collaborative experience. Just moving on very quickly from the pilot, I mentioned earlier that the CMA had made some other recommendations in their 2020 report about things the regulators ought to be doing. And they include making sure that the rules that are out there are actually being followed, that people are complying, looking at whether the rules do what they're intended to do. So for instance, one of the things that the CMA has picked up is that the rules are intended to make sure that information about pricing is easily accessible and it is quite prominent on firm websites. It's not always as accessible as they would like or as we would like. So they're suggesting that regulators need to have a think about whether the rules need to be finessed to do something about that. And there's also the ongoing requirement to think about what works for consumers and to carry on research on what consumers need. So that will be an ongoing priority for us and no doubt for the other regulators over the next year or so. So I'm nearly done, and before we take questions, we just had a few points that we wanted to throw out as ideas. So for anyone who's thinking, okay, this sounds interesting, this sounds like it might be worth exploring a bit further before we've worked through the pilot and we come out with whatever findings we do. Some things that you could go away and do this afternoon if you're interested, and things that we've asked people in the pilot to do already. So number one, as I say, just look at what your clients are already saying about you. Google yourselves, see what's out there. If they're not saying very much at all, that might tell you something in itself. If there are things that you disagree with and they're reasonably recent and you can see a way to engage with that person, then why not give it a go, see how it works. Dip a toe in the water. And second, look at what you're already telling potential clients about your business, because everyone's publishing information on their websites. Some people publish an awful lot of information, some people don't put out very much. But whatever you put out there is informing consumers' view of you and how you compare to other people. So have a look at what you're doing and think about whether there are other pieces of information that you hold that might be of interest to people, that might help them realise why you are the right firm for them. Number three is get in touch with us. So the pilot's ongoing, it's not limited to the people who are already in. We'd really like to hear your experiences, your thoughts about how we can help consumers get the information that they need to make good choices, but in a way that works for you. So our email address is up there on the screen for those who can't quite read it. It's qualityindicators@sra.org.uk. And finally, we will be running another webinar. I mentioned earlier that we've run some in the course of the pilot already. We're now planning one in January to bring together several of the websites and firms to let people hear direct from the websites about how they work, what kind of facilities they can offer to people, and how it works, and how we can all work together to help get that better quality information out there for consumers. So please keep an eye out for that, and you'll be able to register for it on our events page in due course. That is it, just done on 25 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, please put your hand up, grab a mic, which will be circulating, and Richard or I, or both of us, will try to deal with them.
Hi. Quick question on the use of online reviews. We did some analysis into this earlier on this year, which we presented back to the SRA, in which we showed that when you look at a lot of the online reviews, and we're talking specifically here about Trustpilot, who have the biggest single data set, when you analyse that, you find that if you employ techniques like we have, like natural language processing, what you see is when you've got a specific practice area identified in the review, it starts to yield an information set that shows that, well, you might have 40% of the firms clustered quite tightly together at the top, they're doing very well, you can see that they're obviously got a good firm reputation. Underneath that, there can sometimes be a very wide variation in the practice feedback. And this is quite marked across most firms. There's only a tiny percentage of firms that are consistently great across all their different practice areas. Now, one of the things that many of the review companies do is actually, when you've got a subscription service to them, they'll hold that data in the back end. So they don't present it necessarily to consumers at the front end, but they will know the specific fee earners that are linked to a review and so on and so forth. And they don't share that. And one of our challenges back at the time was to say, is there anything the SRA are doing to ask these third-party sites to share some information about practice quality, which would probably give consumers a much cleaner sense of the reputation of the practice in a particular firm.
Okay. So take that off the feedback. I'm not actually cited on that research, I have to say. So, Richard, does that ring a bell with you at all?
Yeah, I think those pieces of research actually they're all really valid for the pilot. I mean, this is the reason we're doing it in this process, is to actually get that information in and then use that as part of the evaluation. Really, I think in terms of that specific research, can you remember? Did that come into our sort of the mailbox we referenced there, or? Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly in terms of those issues you've just raised, those are all relevant for us to consider. Obviously, we don't have direct powers towards comparison websites or review websites specifically, but we've got potential opportunities to talk to those websites and to potentially influence them in other ways through codes of conduct and accreditation, for example. So there are schemes in other sectors that exist for comparison websites. So these are all things that we are exploring through the pilot. So we do really appreciate the information you've sent through so far, and it's not sort of gone into a black hole. We will be using that, for the evaluation stage as well.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, absolutely. The evaluation will be picking up, every lesson we can glean from everything that's going on. So really helpful that people are looking into that and spotting opportunities. Do we have any other questions? No? A couple of smiles? No questions? Oh, sorry, we do. Excellent.
I wanted to know if there was any possibility in the future to regulate small businesses that didn't quite meet the solicitor's qualifications, and in some way perhaps have a system of affiliation so that people who are really dissatisfied with solicitors could go to a different type of company who could do the type of work a solicitor does, although not quite meeting that required qualification, because it would be cheaper for them, more cost effective maybe, and you'd bring more people into the profession that didn't quite have the qualification. Surely there should be some sort of directory. I don't know.
Okay, so that's a good question, thank you. It's slightly outside the scope of most of what we're talking about, which is really about better information for consumers of the firms that we regulate, which are firms of solicitors. But actually the CMA report that I mentioned in the presentation does look at the wider question of how legal services are regulated overall. And it does discuss the fact that it is already possible, because of the reforms over the last 10, 15 years or so, there's already a wide range of people out there who are performing non-reserved legal services, and a variety of regulatory structures under which people perform the reserve services. There's already quite a lot of choice, and actually one of the things the CMA said, slightly oddly for a competition regulator, is that maybe the regulation system needs to be more joined up. Maybe it's a bit too diffuse. So that's something that's ongoing. The point you made about the single register is also relevant to that, because that's actually one of the things that the Legal Services Board has been sort of exploring for a while, and it's discussing that with all the legal regulators, including us. Again, that's potentially one way of making sure that consumers have access to better information. I think one of the things we're conscious of is it the best way of doing it when there are so many solutions that are emerging quite naturally because of almost natural consumer demand, such as the websites that are out there. So I think we feel it's quite important that the Legal Services Board doesn't reinvent the wheel and do something that's already being done. But what's being explored at the moment is, is there a place for that? And if so, how can we make it work? So it's not just a purely academic thing, it's something that will add real value to consumers. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. Any more before we wrap? Got one at the back.
Hi, sorry. I just wanted to ask you, why don't you include Google reviews as part of the websites taking part in the pilot? Considering a lot of firms use Google reviews and some of the other services available here, although we use 3 of them, are not free. You know, they can be quite expensive. Trustpilot is very expensive, whereas reviews.io and review solicitors are much more affordable. There's a tendency for a lot of, prospective customers or clients of law firms to look up Google reviews. Was there any reason why you didn't include them? I was curious about that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. We have tried, I would say. In fact, we were having a discussion just this week with the other legal regulators about whether we need to get together and sort of collectively get our chief executives to write to Google saying, we'd like to involve you in this. Because as you say, a lot of people do use Google reviews. It's so visible if you just go on and search someone on Google. It does have downsides. I think one of them is that it's very easy for people to leave a review without necessarily being verified as a client of the firm. And when you said that some websites are more expensive than others, some offer different services, our approach in this is just to say, well, here's the range of sites that are out there. They can all do different things for you. A lot of them will do things pretty much for free. So that's why we're asking people to go and try out different approaches and see what works for them. We would like to involve Google. Whether legal regulation is big on their current map of things that they're most concerned about in the world, we don't know, but we're going to find out. But yeah, definitely want to follow up. So, very good question. Thank you. Any more? We have one lady here.
Perhaps even directories like Yale.com have reviews, and there's a lot more out there as well that could be included for reviews. So we are on many different sites, and we always wonder, do we need to be on many sites or just one site?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's something that we will be trying to evaluate. Is what's a good approach? What's a good use of the time of legal firms? Because obviously it does take time to deal with this stuff. It's potentially an additional burden, especially for smaller firms. And you can't, as I say, you can't control what your clients do. They can choose to go on whatever site they want and leave a review about you. But possibly if you're making it visible, that you have a channel that you publish on your website that's linked to one of the established sites, or you do it yourself, then that might give people a cue about which site to use. It's a bit like the Wild West at the moment, in that there are all kinds of people doing different things and experimenting with different techniques, and that's kind of, the pilot's almost trying to stir that up to accelerate things a bit. So we don't have any answers, and we're not going to go out there and say to firms, we think you should all use website X. That's absolutely not our role. Our role is, as I say, primarily to work out what works for consumers. And I think there's a whole diversity of approaches that could work, because consumers are not a homogenous mass. They all have different perspectives and different needs. One of the things we're exploring is what information they value. And it's really interesting to see how diverse that is, even from the group of sort of less than a dozen people we had in our office last week. So yeah, we're trying a bit of everything at the moment, and it's going to be quite a while, if ever, before we can start narrowing down and say, this is what we think should happen. But our approach is always going to be driven by the fact that we're the regulator. So we're trying to do what works for consumers, for the wider public interest. And we know that the representative bodies, people like the Law Society, will also have an interest, and will no doubt in due course be advising their members on what they think works for them, and is in their own best interests as firms and as solicitors. Okay, we have a little more time. Have a couple more over here.
I'm not sure if you're recording the ethnicity of the people in the law firm, so people know whether or not they can choose to go to a law firm that might be more ethnically diverse.
Okay, we certainly do have information on diversity, which we track, because it's an important part of what we do to promote a more diverse and equal profession. In terms of whether we're providing information to consumers about basically the ethnicity of the partners in firms, I think that's the level at which we hold information. I'm not sure that we do that at the moment, Richard. No. But again, it's an interesting idea and one we will log and think about. And again, that'll hopefully be something that flows from the work we're doing with consumers to see what they value. It's not actually something that had occurred to me that consumers might be keen to use a firm where they know that the partners there have certain characteristics. So that's definitely something that we will dig into. So thank you.
Something that I find quite frustrating is that the SRA only really has a list on their website of solicitors. I'm actually a chartered legal executive and I've been in practice for many years now, and it is very difficult for consumers to be able to actually differentiate between solicitors and legal executives. But more to the point, we've got other legal professionals like licensed conveyancers, etc. Surely the SRA should be putting on their websites links through to other regulatory authorities whereby people can search, or the SRA should have people who are qualified like fellows on their sites, and people can be checked out that way by consumers.
Yep, thank you. It's an absolutely valid point. It's a confusing world out there, and it's partly because so much of the information, like the registers, are organised by regulated profession, not by who can help you with your legal problem. But actually, I think part of the answer to that is the Legal Choices website, which I mentioned earlier, because that is actually run by the SRA, but it's on behalf of all the legal frontline regulators. And if you go on there, you can search by name, firm or solicitor, and whichever regulator they're authorised by, they will pop up and you'll be able to see their regulatory history, their legal ombudsman history. And of course, you'll then have an idea of who they are. You can go away and research further. That's, again, I mentioned earlier the idea of the single register that the Legal Services Board is considering and that we're all helping them to discuss. But that goes back to what I was saying about not wanting to reinvent the wheel if there are other things out there that do that. I absolutely take the point that the regulators could probably do a bit more to show the public that there are other sources of help. Yeah. And again, we're going back to the slide I had earlier with all the logos on it. We are working with all the most of the frontline regulators on this, certainly the ones that consumers are likely to approach directly. And we'll be coming up jointly with our ideas for how to move this on. So definitely something we could pick up. Thank you. We have a few more minutes if there are any more questions. Don't think there are. So I'll just say thank you very much indeed for joining us and for all the questions, really helpful. Richard and I are here for a few minutes, and then we'll be over at the SRA stand, which is over in that direction, if you'd like to come up and talk to us about any of this or anything else. But otherwise, thank you very much. Good to see you.